The wind does not simply blow across the Uinta Basin, it mourns. For decades, the world looked at the jagged horizon of Skinwalker Ranch and saw a playground for lights in the sky and shadows in the brush. We were told of portals, of dire wolves that shrugged off lead, and of cattle found hollowed out under a desert moon. But we were looking at the wrong canvas. We were staring at the stars while the truth was breathing beneath our boots. 1 minute ago, the static of 1,000 redacted files finally cleared. The heavy machinery didn't just strike stone, it struck a nerve in the earth itself. As the drill bits shattered against something that shouldn't exist, something metallic, ancient, and pulsing with a rhythmic, biological heat, the realization set in. The ranch wasn't a site of visitation. It was a lid, a cork on a bottle containing a prehistoric, sentient nightmare. The question no longer is, what is visiting us? But rather, what have we been walking on top of for centuries, and why is it finally waking up? The desert sun is a cruel observer. It casts long, skeletal shadows across the scrubland, illuminating the dust motes that dance in the stagnant air. Dr. Eris Thorne stood at the edge of the triangle, his boots caked in the reddish-gray clay that had swallowed the sanity of better men than him. For 3 years, he had chased ghosts with Geiger counters and thermal cameras. He had expected to find a frequency, a craft, or perhaps a hallucination. He never expected to find a pulse. The machinery hummed a low, discordant tune. It was a heavy-duty industrial auger, the kind used to pierce the hardest granite, but today it was struggling. The operator, a man whose face was a map of Nevada dust and regret, looked at Thorne. There was fear in his eyes, a raw, primal thing. "It's not hitting rock, Doc," he whispered over the roar of the engine. It's pushing back." Thorne knelt, pressing his gloved hand to the vibrating earth. He closed his eyes, leaning into the sensory details of the moment. The smell of ionized air, like a coming thunderstorm that never breaks. The taste of copper on the back of his tongue. He remembered the stories the local Ute elders told, voices hushed by the flickering firelight. They spoke of the Shinnemocovi, the land of the lead-lined sleepers. They had warned that the earth here was not a floor, but a ceiling. Psychologically, Thorne felt the tether to his rational world snapping. He was a man of peer-reviewed journals and empirical data. Yet as he looked at the digital readout of the seismic sensors, the numbers formed a pattern that shouldn't exist. It was a rhythmic oscillation. Thump thump, thump thump. "Shut it down," Thorne commanded, his voice barely a rasp. The engine died. The silence that followed was heavy, viscous, and suffocating. It wasn't the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a room where someone is holding their breath. Thorne leaned over the borehole, a narrow black pupil staring back at the sky. He lowered a fiber-optic camera, his hands trembling. The monitor flickered, struggling against an electromagnetic interference that felt intentional. As the camera descended 30, 40, 50 feet, the jagged walls of dirt gave way to something smooth, something dark. It was a surface that absorbed the camera's light like a sponge. And then, the audio feed clicked on. From the depths of the Uinta Basin, a sound rose through the headset. It was low, guttural, and undeniably biological. A long, wet intake of breath, followed by a vibration that rattled Thorne's very teeth. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a cave. It was a lung. Thorne looked up at the horizon, at the silent mesa that had watched this valley for millennia. He realized then that the paranormal activity, the orbs, the vanished cattle, the shadow figures, were just white blood cells. They were defending a body, and they had just felt the sting of the needle. As Thorne reached to pull the camera back, the cable was yanked downward with such violence it nearly took his arm with it. From the hole, a faint, rhythmic blue light began to glow. The files were never meant to see the light of day. In the windowless war room of the ranch's command center, Thorne sifted through the legacy of the NIDS era, the National Institute for Discovery Science. In the 90s, they had called it a study. Now, Thorne knew it was an autopsy. He found a folder, the edges singed as if saved from a fire. Inside were sketches from a scientist who had suffered a complete mental breakdown in 1997. The drawings didn't show UFOs. They showed nervous systems. Miles of golden, metallic filaments woven through the sandstone, connecting the mesa to the homesteads like a sprawling, subterranean brain. The psychological toll of this place was becoming a physical weight. Thorne hadn't slept in 72 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ranch from a bird's-eye view. But the hills were muscles, and the rivers were veins. He felt the guilt of the men who came before him, the ones who realized that by digging, they weren't discovering a secret, they were wounding a god. The deeper they looked into the skin of the ranch, the more the ranch looked back. The hitchhiker effect, that terrifying phenomenon where the ranch's darkness follows you home, was explained in the notes. It wasn't a curse. It was a spore, a biological frequency that latched onto the human consciousness, using the observer as a carrier to see the world outside the basin. Thorne walked outside, the cold night air hitting his face. The sky was an obsidian mirror. He looked at the spot where they had hit the lung. The ground there was now warm to the touch, the snow melting in a perfect circle despite the freezing temperatures. He felt a presence behind him, a shadow that didn't belong to a person. It was a tall, distorted shape that moved with a disjointed, rhythmic grace. "You're waking it up," a voice whispered. Thorne spun around, but there was no one there. Only the wind, and the faint, metallic scent of the earth bleeding. He returned to the journal, flipping to the final, frantic page. The scientist had written one last sentence before being committed to a high-security ward. It wasn't a warning for the government. It was an apology to the planet. The final sentence read, "The ranch is not a place. It is a mask. I have seen what is behind the eyes of the mesa, and it is hungry for the sun." The excavation site at the base of the mesa had become a cathedral of heavy machinery and paranoia. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting the valley in a bruised purple light, the secondary drill team hit the skeletal layer. It wasn't stone. It wasn't even the dark, organic mass from the day before. It was a lattice of iridescent, non-terrestrial alloy that hummed at a frequency which made the men's noses bleed. Thorne stood at the edge of the pit, looking down into the silver ribcage of the earth. The structures were miles long, curving with a mathematical precision that defied human engineering. They weren't just buried. They were woven into the tectonic plates. This was the nervous system the 1990s files had alluded to, a planet-scale conductor of consciousness. The psychological pressure on the crew had reached a breaking point. One by one, the engineers began reporting the same dream, a vast, unblinking eye-opening beneath their beds. The hitchhiker wasn't just following them home anymore. It was colonizing their minds. Thorne felt his own identity fraying. He found himself staring at his hands, wondering if the copper-tasting air was rewriting his own DNA. Was he still the observer, or was he becoming part of the ranch's sensory array? "Dr. Thorne, look at the chemical analysis," his lead researcher, Sarah, whispered. Her voice was thin, haunted. She held a tablet showing a molecular breakdown of the soil surrounding the metallic veins. It wasn't silicon or carbon. It was a synthetic, programmable matter, nanoscopic machines that mimicked the behavior of biological cells. The ranch wasn't just a living entity. It was a terraforming engine. It had been sitting here for eons, slowly digesting the local environment, mimicking the flora and fauna to hide its presence. The skinwalkers weren't shapeshifters from legend. They were the engine's mobile probes, biological drones printed from the very dirt they walked on. The sound from the depths changed. The rhythmic breathing of Chapter 1 evolved into a low-frequency broadcast, a series of pulses that felt like words felt in the gut rather than heard in the ears. "Return. Restore. Remain." Thorne ordered the team to push the drill 1 inch further. He needed to see the core. He needed to know if there was a heart at the center of this clockwork nightmare. As the diamond-tipped bit ground against the iridescent rib, the ground didn't vibrate, it shivered. A dark, viscous fluid began to seep upward, defying gravity, crawling up the drill string like an ink-black ivy. It didn't smell like oil. It smelled like ancient, stagnant seawater and ozone. Sarah reached out a hand, mesmerized by the liquid. It's responding to us," she murmured. Before Thorne could stop her, the fluid leaped. The obsidian liquid didn't just touch Sarah's skin, it vanished into her pores. Her eyes turned a solid, reflective silver, and she turned to Thorne with a smile that wasn't human. "It's finally time to breathe," she said, her voice echoing with 1,000 overlapping tones. The breach was no longer a scientific achievement. It was an invitation. As the lid, The reinforced crust of the mesa shattered under the pressure of the subterranean entity. The ranch's reality began to fold in on itself. The sky above the triangle warped into a shimmering geodesic dome, trapping the team within a localized pocket of nonlinear time. Thorne ignored the sirens. He followed the silver-eyed Sarah toward the center of the breach. The air was no longer gas. It felt like walking through a heavy, electromagnetic liquid. Every step was a struggle against a tide of memories that weren't his. The birth of the stars, the cooling of the Earth's crust, and the arrival of the seed. They descended into the main chamber, a cathedral of pulsing light and geometric shadows. Here, the lung was visible, a massive, translucent organ the size of a city block, suspended by the metallic veins they had uncovered. It glowed with a sickly, bioluminescent rhythm. This was the Sentinel. It had been placed here by a civilization that predated the dinosaurs, a silent observer tasked with recording the evolution of the planet. But something had gone wrong. The Sentinel wasn't just observing, it was suffering. The skin of the ranch, the portals, and the poltergeists were the spasms of a dying god. The radiation Thorne had been measuring for years wasn't a weapon, it was a leak. "We are the infection, Sarah, or the thing wearing her," said, her voice vibrating through the very floor. "You're tapping, you're drilling, you've broken the seal. The Sentinel can no longer contain what it was meant to hide." Thorne looked past the lung, into the deep darkness of the furthest reaches of the cavern. There, held in check by the Sentinel's fading light, was the real secret. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a monster. It was a doorway to a dimension of pure, chaotic entropy. The ranch wasn't a site of visitation. It was a cork in the neck of a bottle that held the end of everything. The Skinwalkers appeared then, emerging from the walls. They weren't the terrifying wolves of legend, but pale, translucent guardians, their faces shifting between every person who had ever died on the ranch. They knelt before the pulsing lung, their bodies dissolving into light to feed the failing machine. "You wanted to know what was hidden," the entity and Sarah said, stepping toward the edge of the abyss. "Now you must help us hold the door." The rhythmic heartbeat of the ranch suddenly stopped. For 3 seconds, there was absolute, terrifying stillness. Then a hand, massive, gray, and dripping with the void, reached out from the darkness behind the lung and gripped the edge of our world. The 1 minute ago that changed history ended not with a bang, but with a suffocating, collective realization. The authorities moved in with a speed and coldness that suggested they had been waiting for this disaster for decades. Within hours, the entire Uinta Basin was declared a dead zone. Lead-lined concrete was poured into the boreholes by the ton, a desperate, futile attempt to put the cap back on a bottle that had already shattered. Thorne sat in the back of a blacked-out transport vehicle, his hands bound, his eyes shielded. He could still feel the vibration in his bones. He knew the concrete wouldn't work. You can't bury a thought, and the Sentinel had already whispered its final truth into the minds of everyone on the ranch. The ranch was a legacy of a forgotten war. "We are not the masters of this planet. We are the moss growing on a tomb." The psychological fallout was immediate. The crew members were whisked away to black sites, not for debriefing, but for containment. They were carriers now. The hitchhiker effect had evolved from a haunting into a slow-motion takeover of the human psyche. As the transport climbed the ridge, Thorne looked back one last time. Through a gap in the curtains, he saw the mesa. It didn't look like a rock formation anymore. In the dim light of dawn, he saw the subtle, rhythmic rise and fall of the earth. The lid was gone, replaced by a thin, shimmering veil of distorted space. The authorities would tell the world it was a gas leak, a hoax, or a localized magnetic anomaly. They would redact the metallic veins and the obsidian blood. But Thorne knew the truth. Every time a person somewhere in the world felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, every time a shadow moved in a room where no one stood, it was the ranch. It was the entity underneath, stretching its newly freed limbs through the cracks in our reality. The final sensor reading Thorne had managed to see before his equipment was seized haunted his every waking moment. The heartbeat hadn't just accelerated, it had synchronized. It was no longer the slow, lonely pulse of a buried god. It was beating in time with the hearts of every human being on the planet. The ranch didn't wake up to destroy us. It woke up to be us. The legacy of Skinwalker Ranch isn't found in the lights in the sky or the holes in the ground. It is found in the mirror. We are the skin it is currently wearing. In the silence of his holding cell, Thorne felt a familiar itch on the back of his hand. He looked down and watched, paralyzed, as a small, iridescent metallic vein began to pulse rhythmically beneath his skin.